Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to initiate these Future AI webinars today. So we will start with a great talk by Professor Gary Collins from the University of Oxford. He will tell us about best practices and tools for increased transparency. So this is part of the Future AI webinar series. So the Future AI paper was recently published at the BMJ journal, and it described a number of key principles and best practices to design, develop, evaluate, and deploy trustworthy AI tool in healthcare. So this was a collaboration by 170 experts from all continents who worked together for 3 years. We defined the 6 guiding principles: fairness, universality, traceability, usability, robustness, and explainability. We think they capture directly or indirectly all the key requirements of trustworthy and ethical AI. What we also did is we defined a number of best practices, 30 in total, that are structured around the main phases of the AI lifecycle. And so we will try to have these webinars once a month to discuss one aspect of trustworthy and ethical AI, because there's a lot to say, and we hope through these discussions we can update these guidelines every year, because of course there are things that will change, there are things we need to improve. So we really count on your presence and also on your feedback. So today we will focus on one aspect of these best practices, which is transparency and how to report the AI studies. And we are very pleased to welcome Professor Gary Collins today from the University of Oxford, who is one of the co-authors of the paper. He is an expert in medical statistics and has been working for years on predictive models, and has developed, he was one of the first to develop these methodologies and these standards on how to develop, evaluate, and then report these predictive models. Then he extended these methodologies to include AI-based predictive models through the TRIPOD+AI standard. So we are very, very happy to have today with us Professor Gary Collins. After the talk, which will last about 30 minutes, I will collect some of the questions on the chat, and we will ask them to Gary. So Gary, thank you for being our first speaker, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, just one last check. You can see my slides okay? Wonderful. Well, first of all, thanks, Karim, for inviting me on this first Future AI webinar series. Delighted to be able to talk to you around the issues around transparency in predictive AI. So leading on from the Future AI manuscript, which hopefully you've all seen, that we set out 30 best practices addressing various aspects around the AI pipeline. And these are guided by 6 principles, fairness, universality, traceability, usable, robust, and explainable. And all of that is underpinned by transparency. We don't have anything unless we're transparent in how we do this research. So I'll plow straight on. So, we do research, hopefully to advance scientific knowledge. We do that directly or indirectly, because we want to improve treatments, prevention of disease, patient outcomes, efficiency in the workflow. And that's all predicated on a good research question, a well-designed study. We do that study well, we conduct it correctly, we recruit patients on a nice representative cohort, and then we tell the world why we did that piece of research, how we did it, and what the findings are. This should all be common sense, but I'll show later on it's probably not always common sense. And we do that we communicate this or disseminate our research via scientific manuscripts, so we should hopefully present sufficient information so that you as a reader, me as a reader, we can evaluate the robustness of that research you have just done. We should avoid misinterpreting the findings from our study, avoiding any spin or hype. Increasingly, long gone are the days where readers of clinical journals are clinicians themselves. Readers are now much more diverse. They're other researchers to help plan their own research, to plan a similar type study, to do a systematic review. Patients and consumers are increasingly reading research publications to help their personal decision making, and policy makers, purchase of AI tools or medical interventions also are another type of readership. And there are probably more readership. So it's important that when we do our study and we write up in a manuscript, that we provide all the information to this increasingly larger group of stakeholders who need to understand while we do our research. Want reproducibility. So, the manuscript should provide sufficient information so that if I, as a reader, if I had your code or if I had your data, then I could, in principle, reproduce the findings. We want research that we can rely on and is trustworthy. And that manuscript in Nature Medicine or the BMJ or whatever is usually the only tangible evidence that a study was ever done. So we've got to get it correct. We've got to get that manuscript correct. It has to be transparent, and complete, with all the details necessary to judge the study. Recently, the Declaration of Helsinki, so these are guiding ethical principles about doing medical research on human participants. This was updated and published in JAMA in January 2025. And they have a bunch of principles about how we do research, how we have to use methodologically sound methods. We should avoid this thing called research waste. So that's doing research that has no value. And one of those contributors to research waste are studies that are incompletely reported. We have a study, you've done your study, but you haven't told the reader enough information that they can actually use that research. So that's avoidable research waste. You've done the research, but actually nobody can use it because the information is not there. Research should be protocol driven. We should declare our funding, conflicts of interest, etc. We should try and register. So if you do a clinical trial, you can't get your clinical trial published these days unless that trial was published on some kind of registry. And I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the context of predictive AI. And also, according to the Declaration of Helsinki, we have a duty to report our study in a timely manner. So let's not do the study and wait 5 years to publish it. It should be complete and it should be accurate. And if any part or any aspect of that research process is absent, then the Declaration of Helsinki says that published research, that research should not be published. So we've got to follow these guidelines as researchers in biomedical research. Hopefully some of you might have come across this chap here, Doug Altman. So he's my former boss for 15 years. If you've ever heard of the phrase, we need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons, this is one of Doug's quotes. So he was a bit of a pioneer in terms of the world of transparency in healthcare research and has an absolute raft of achievements to his name. But one of his quotes, and he had many of them, was, readers should not have to infer what was probably done. They should be told explicitly. So when we read our research article, or somebody's research article, we shouldn't have to guess what they did. We shouldn't have to infer what they did. We need to be told explicitly why you did your research, how you did it, and what the results are. That should be obvious. But actually, we know from lots of meta-research studies that biomedical research, preclinical studies, animal studies, diagnostic studies, epidemiological studies, prediction research, which is now under the umbrella of predictive AI and qualitative studies, they have are characterized by quite a lot of bad reporting. It's either incomplete or it's misleading. And that contributes to this thing, as I mentioned earlier on, called research waste. And there was a piece of research done in 2014 in The Lancet setting out a bunch of papers around how you can look at research waste and initiatives to improve that. And reporting guidelines, which I'll get onto very shortly, are one of those interventions to try and improve the research landscape, research integrity. So the Equator Network was set up. So again, I hope some of you might have heard of the Equator Network. We are an international initiative to try and improve the quality and transparency of health research, and we do that via something called these reporting guidelines. They are a set of minimal essential items that you should include when you write up your study. So if you've ever submitted an article to a biomedical journal like the BMJ, JAMA Lancet, they will have asked you to adhere to a reporting guideline. And these are guidance. They're like a checklist, a shopping list of things you should include. So, have an informative title. Tell us about your study sample. Tell us about aspects of the methods, what the results are, and the implications of these things. And they comprise of a list of 20 to 30 items that you should report. They're community driven, usually involving a multidisciplinary group with researchers, clinicians, patients, funders, regulators depending on the field, policymakers. And these are some of the most highly cited pieces of research out there. They're often accompanied by something called an explanation and elaboration paper. So this is some additional guidance on top of the reporting guideline, explaining why we need this information, why is it important. They often give examples of good reporting. So if you're thinking about actually how should I report a certain thing in my manuscript, then these explanation and elaboration documents provide that detail. And you may have come across these two reporting guidelines. These are the early pioneers in this space. So the CONSORT checklist. So if you've done a clinical trial, you would have been asked to fill out the CONSORT checklist. If you've done a systematic review, then you would have had to include and adhere to the PRISMA 2020 checklist. They're endorsed increasingly by journals. Journals expect them. So if you go into instructions for authors, when you submit your manuscript, the Equator Network or specific reporting guidelines will be mentioned, and you'll be requested to adhere to them. So if you submit your article to the BMJ, for example, you will have to complete a checklist saying which page number have I reported the sample size on, which page number have I reported things around missing data. And your manuscript will not get sent out for peer review unless you've submitted that checklist alongside your manuscript. So journals are enforcing adherence to them. And increasingly funders like the NIH, the NIHR, increasingly will ask you to have these reporting guidelines when you do your research. So here's an example from JAMA. Follow the Equator reporting guidelines. These are embedded into the research ecosystem and in the editorial systems these days. So in addition to try and improve patient outcomes or improve future research, what is the incentive of transparently and completely reporting your study? Well, we want our research to be used. We want our research to be cited. So here's a study that looked at whether the quality and completeness of reporting in these particular types of studies in radiology, were they associated with increased citation rates? And that's what they showed, is that the better reported your study, the more likely someone's going to read it, someone's going to use it, and therefore they're going to cite it in their own research. And hopefully that has an influence then on future research. Hopefully that influences patient outcomes going forward. So that's kind of like the preemptive stuff on why we need transparency. Let's move on to the main focus of this talk, and this is around predictive AI or prediction models. It's a hot topic. You know, so I've been working in this field since around about 2007. And you can see around about 2015, you know, there's the number of papers are trotting along. You know, a lot of people were doing prediction models using regression methods, but something happened around about 2016, 2017. For some reason, everybody's decided that, you know, machine learning and AI are the next hot topics, and we saw a massive uptick in research in this area. And so we have this complete model mania at the moment. You know, there are thousands of models that are being developed, you know, using machine learning methods, regression methods that are published on a weekly basis. And that's pretty staggering stuff. You know, just to illustrate the model mania, you know, here's an example of a single data set. So this is the SEER data set. This is a cancer registry from the US. Literally covers nearly half of the US population. But if you did a simple search on PubMed, there are over, so this is just a one disease data set. A simple search on Medline, there are over 2,000 papers that are developing or validating some kind of predictive AI tool using that single data set. So it's a cancer registry, yet there are over 2,000 papers just using that single data set, and most of them published in the last 5 years. In 2024, there were over 500 papers using that single data set to develop some predictive AI tool. So, you know, we're seeing this huge volume of research in this area. So pre this ML AI uptick in the mid 2010s, most models were developed using regression-based methods, but they were done quite poorly, often quite poorly. Of course, there'll be examples that were really good, but characterizing the literature in this field pre-machine learning, it wasn't great. You know, missing data. You know, we can barely do a research study these days and collect all the information we need on every single participant. You know, if we use an existing data, there will be missing values. Yet we somehow, to develop a good model or to test that model, we need to somehow replace those missing values. And quite often in the pre-ML era, that was rarely described very well and rarely handled very well. Most of the time, you know, you think if you're doing a prediction model study in the pre-machine learning era, you know, that's typically a regression model, that's an equation, and the product of that piece of work should be that equation. Yeah, we know from lots of meta-research studies that the actual equation itself or the code to implement that equation is rarely reported or rarely made available. So that means me as an independent researcher, I can't validate or test that model in some other data because I don't have the model or the equation or the code. And that's a problem. You know, we have things around assessing the performance of these prediction models, you know, so typically you'll focus on the AUC as a measure of discrimination or a ranking-based measure, but also we're interested in calibration. And that's how well does the predictions from the model, does that meet reality or what was observed? Lots of studies didn't assess calibration, and there are lots of other concerns, and there's a whole wealth of research in this area highlighting the deficiencies of prediction models in the pre-ML era. So there's no point moaning about this all the time. So back in 2010, I and some colleagues, we started this thing called the TRIPOD initiative, which we published in 2015, and these are a set of recommendations for researchers to report when you're developing or evaluating your prediction model. Back in 2015, we did not cover machine learning because nobody in the clinical literature really was doing it. Of course, there was the odd random forest or the odd support vector machine or the odd neural network, but really, compared to today, nobody was really doing it. But most of the recommendations in that original tripod statement are applicable to predictive AI. And we published this very long 73-page manuscript to accompany the checklist in the Annals of Internal Medicine, which touches on how to do things, best practice in terms of methodology. We also took the opportunity to highlight bad practices, things you shouldn't do, just as a didactic tool for researchers to hopefully improve how they do their research studies. And these are widely cited documents, and I think they're widely used as well. But it needs to be tailored to the AI world. The world has moved on since 2015, and we need to update this, and I'll talk about TRIPOD+AI very shortly. But do we have a problem? Does it need fixing? In the pre-ML world, so in the regression modeling world, there was a problem with poor methods, poor design, poor reporting. Do we have a problem now with AI research? Are they well done? Well, unfortunately, this field is also characterized by very poorly designed studies. They're often too small. The methods that are being used are often quite weak or methodologically flawed. They're rife with what we call risk of bias or poor quality, poor reporting, and often, they're overinterpreted. The findings are embellished beyond what the results say. And we did this in a series. We showed this in a series of 2 reviews, one led by my group in Oxford, and one led by a group led by Carl Moons in Utrecht. But we looked at, we did some meta research to evaluate the state of the published machine learning literature in the clinical field. And we looked at the adherence to the original TRIPOD guideline that we published in 2015 in both of those sets of reviews, and the reporting was quite poor. So those bars, you don't need to read the text on the axes, but those horizontal bars, they should all be going to 100%, implying that all the information required on that reporting guideline is reported completely in all studies. Yet you can see from those 2 plots there that very, very few studies were reporting the information we wanted to authors to report. And the consequence of that was that, let's say go back to the COVID era, we did a review looking at prediction models for COVID-19. These were diagnostic and prognostic models. We identified over 600 models in a 15-month period, and these were characterized by just really poorly done studies. So on your top right is what's called a risk of bias plot, where we look at concerns of the study, whether the participants were representative, or was there something going on that makes the sampling of the participants biased? Were the definition of the predictors, were there something going on there that might have been influenced the bias in the findings? Was the outcome defined in a strange way that could influence the bias in the findings? Were there aspects of the analysis that could be biased and alter conclusions? And what we found is that when you see a red, means studies were really poorly done. So they use weak methods. That's not great. Studies that are flagged in green means they're really well done, and those in yellow mean the studies were unclear or not reported. And of those 606 models we found, only 29 had low risk of bias. Only 29 could we recommend to be used in practice. Most of them had high risk of bias due to poor methods. And the few had unclear risk of bias. The authors didn't tell us the information we needed to make a judgment as to whether the methods they used were good or not. So at a time where models could have influenced patient care, most of the models we identified weren't great. And most of these were AI or machine learning driven. We've done other research in this area, looking at machine learning research. This is relatively old now, back in 2019. Though nothing's changed now, but we did this review of studies that were comparing logistic regression to machine learning methods, random forest, support vector machines, XGBoost, neural networks, and those kind of studies again were characterized by, small sample sizes, incoherent or lack of handle of missing data, No details on parameter tuning, validation, how did you validate the model was often quite sparse or absent, etc., etc. But why does that matter? Why do we want well-done studies, or why do we need well-reported studies? Well, let's do a head-to-head comparison. So in that study, we did a head-to-head comparison, and we wanted to look at, well, is there any evidence as to whether machine learning was, quotes, better than the good old logistic regression? So we did all this review, and we extracted all the AUCs, that did all these comparisons, and the bottom line was yes. It seems like everything on that right hand side of that grey vertical line indicates that a machine learning method is better than logistic regression across the board, apart from a single decision trees. Random forests were performing better, support vector machines were performing better, neural networks were performing better, and overall, that black square would suggest across all the comparisons we looked at face value, logistic regression was performing poorly compared to machine learning literature. But what if we actually pulled out those studies that were at low risk of bias? So we've done some kind of methodological quality assessment, which is predicated on the authors telling us all the information around how they developed and validated their model. And let's pull out those low risk of bias studies. So these are the higher quality studies. What do the results tell me now? Well, they tell me, as I would have expected a priori, actually systematically, logistic regression does not perform any better or any worse than machine learning methods. Yet, if we hadn't had the information, if we'd gone at face value, if we ignored the report, and if we ignored the methodological quality and just focused on looking at whether logistic regression was better than machine learning, our conclusions would be very, very different. So good design, good methods, transparency is really key because it impacts how we interpret study findings. And that's not good. Saying machine learning works better than logistic regression, it sells, it's hype, it builds into that narrative around AI, but actually it doesn't necessarily help patients. We want robust, strongly designed, well-reported research so it can be trustworthy. Now we see other things around questionable research practice. So hopefully you've heard of p-hacking or harking, where you see p-values often just below the 0.05 threshold or the 0.01 threshold. We see peaks where people are just tweaking the results slightly. Well, actually, can we observe similar practices in prediction research? So one of the things we calculate in a prediction model study is this AUC, or the C statistic, or the C index, the area under the ROC curve. It's our measure of model discrimination. It's one of the main things we report. Are authors doing something funny here? Well, with Nicole White and Adrian Barnett from Queensland, we did this study where we took the abstracts from nearly over 300,000 articles on PubMed and extracted the AUCs. And as you can see, there are little dips just above thresholds. So that curve, because it's so large, it should be a smooth curve or smooth histogram. But actually we're seeing peaks just above 0.7, just above 0.8, just above 0.9. What does that suggest? Does that suggesting authors are falsifying their findings, or they're tweaking their results to make it look better? It goes past that threshold. Everybody wants their model to be at least 0.7, and in some areas they want it to be at least 0.8. So are there some questionable practice going on? That histogram would suggest that there is some evidence of AUC hacking. Could we preempt this, or could we counter this? Well, if we had registration, possibly. And if you do a clinical trial, you need to register. You need to have a protocol. Should we have the same standards for predictive AI research? I think so. And that might preempt this potential gaming or questionable research practices. It just gives you an extra level of transparency if we have registration protocols to guard against AUC hacking. We're in an era where we should be adopting open science practices. And I'm sure hopefully all of you try and do this in your own research. We'd like to have a protocol. Every piece of work I do generally has a protocol. We try and make this thing available on the open science framework. Even developing a reporting guideline like TRIPOD, we have a protocol. If you're doing a clinical trial, you have a protocol. If you're doing a predictive AI tool, ideally you should have a protocol somewhere, and ideally you should make this protocol available. Data sharing, that's hard, but we need to start sharing data, and we need to go beyond those silly little statements saying data are available upon reasonable request, because we know from research that when people have followed that up and requested data where the manuscripts have said that it's available on reasonable request, those requests are often ignored. So the reality is we're not sharing data, and we could share data much more. That's with the caveats that not all data can be ethically or legally or contractually shared. And similarly with code, we should be sharing our code. That's sharing the code to reproduce the study, reproduce all the results, but also the code to implement that predictive AI tool. And again, I'm caveating that with not all tools may necessarily be able to be shared if they're proprietary. But you should at least tell readers that you can or cannot share something. And we did a study last year to look at the open science practices in the machine learning literature, and it's poor. There's no way of getting around this. People aren't doing open science at scale. And we should be avoiding spin. When we do our research and we write in the findings, we should be honest in how we report our study. Be honest to say what the results are showing. So here's an example, and it's one of my favorite examples of pure madness. Is these are calibration curves. So the calibration is whether your predicted risk from your model aligns with what was observed. So that black line should lie on that diagonal y equals x at 45 degrees if your model was well calibrated, or around that line. You can see on both calibration curves that black line is not lying on that red line. And I don't think you need to be an expert in prediction models to conclude that. However, these authors interpret those curves as the calibration curves showed a good agreement between the predictive risk and the actual probability. Clearly, those curves are not showing that. So we need to be honest in how we do that. So again, to be a bit more positive, let's try and fix the ML literature. Let's try going forward. Let's try and provide some recommendations for authors and researchers in doing predictive AI in the healthcare space. So we updated the TRIPOD guidelines to something called TRIPOD+AI, which was published in the BMJ last year. Hopefully some of you might have seen that. And this now provides harmonized guidance for the predictive AI in healthcare world, and that's regardless of whether you're fitting a regression model or a Cox or logistic regression model, or if you're fitting something a little bit more complex. So we had this very large consensus-based process, over 200 people, 27 countries, we've got 6 of the continents involved, and then we hold this expert consensus meeting with a raft of key stakeholders in this field: researchers, clinicians, policymakers, patients, journal editors, funds, etc. And we came up with this reporting guideline. I'm not going to go through the reporting guideline itself because it's not the most exciting thing to do, but it's a checklist of recommendations that you should report in your study. How have you prepared your data? How have you defined your outcome? What are the objectives? Where's your data come from? What's the provenance of your data? And on your right-hand side, you just write the page number of your manuscript where you have reported that information. And then you can submit this checklist alongside your manuscript, so the editors or the reviewers then know that you have covered this information in your manuscript. So just repeat, the recommendations are agnostic to the modeling approach. We have now a particular emphasis on fairness, which is one of the future AI principles. We have that expressed through describing your data and the representativeness of that data. Are you evaluating the performance of your models in key subgroups? Those often defined by protected attributes, like sex or ethnicity, etc. And that's embedded throughout the checklist. I'll just point out, when we published TRIPOD+AI, from the point of publishing the first or writing the first draft of submission, the world got taken over by generative AI. So TRIPOD+AI does not cover generative AI. There's a different reporting guideline called TRIPOD+LLM, which does cover that, which was published in Nature Medicine earlier this year. So TRIPOD+AI is more around the supervised learning type methods. And what do we include? What are the things to include in TRIPOD? Well, we want authors. It's quite surprising when you read many prediction model papers, is researchers don't tell you why their model is needed in the first place. What kind of clinical decision are you expecting the model to support? So we want authors to tell us that. We want to tell us about the provenance of your data. So increasingly we're seeing data that's being made up or fabricated, and we want authors to tell us something about where your data's come from. Is it really representative of the target population in whom you want to use that prediction model? Tell us about your missing data. Tell us about sample size, not just model training, but also testing. Now, once you've developed your model, you need to tell readers, where can I find your model? Is it freely available? Is it proprietary? That's fine if it's proprietary. I mean, I don't like things to be proprietary as an academic, but that I've faced reality that some tools are proprietary, but just tell the reader that they are not available. We have a new item which wasn't included in the original TRIPOD around the involvement of patients and the patients and the public. Were they involved in your predictive AI study? Were they involved in the planning? Were they involved in the dissemination or the reporting of your research? Increasingly, we're expected to have PPI involvement in biomedical healthcare research. At least in the UK, a lot of the researchers, or the funders, sorry, will not fund you without having some PPI involvement. Journals are increasingly. The BMJ asks you, and they ask you to report an explicit statement on whether patients and the public were involved in your research. And there may be instances that you can't afford, or you didn't budget in the PPI, and they weren't involved, but you should tell the reader that there was no PPI involvement in your study. And this was a contentious item when we were deriving the guidelines. And people were saying, how can they be involved? How can they involve input into the development? Well, they can, but in different ways. So here's an example from a BMJ article from a study that developed a prediction model for predicting kidney failure and death, and they described how patients were involved in the design phase. And that's all that manuscript needed. It just needed some information around whether they were consulted on the need of that study. TRIPOD also includes a nice open science section where we explicitly asked authors to declare funding, which is an increasingly important consideration in predictive AI, a bit like in the drug context as well for clinical trials. We, increasingly startups and tech companies, we need that to be declared in your research. If your study was registered, protocols, etc. Whether your data is available, it may not be available, but at least tell the reader that you can't share it. And similarly with code, is your code available to implement the model? And these should all be declared If you can't share them, then at least tell the reader they can't be shared and give the reasons why. Nearly finished. To accompany these guidelines, we have a very long checklist which blows up each item in the actual tripod reporting guideline and provides extra information on the things you should report or disclose in your research. And that you'll find that in Supplementary Table 1 on the BMJ article website, just to give a bit more guidance to authors and researchers. What other reporting guidelines are in this space? Well, there's something called the Decide AI guidelines. So increasingly we want these tools to be usable. So this touches on the future AI usability principle. We want human factors or studies that evaluate these tools with a human in the loop approach. These are safety studies, the feasibility. We don't want to go to a very costly randomized controlled trial to evaluate the predictive AI tool. We need to do some preparatory work in these early stage AI studies, and the Decide reporting guideline provides some recommendations on how to report and do those types of studies. And once we've got to the next part of the path line, we're going to do a randomized controlled trial, and then there's the Spirit and the Consort reporting guidelines for doing a randomized controlled trial study of an AI intervention tool, and they provide recommendations of the kind of information we want to see as readers. But the whole landscape of predictive AI, there are reported guidelines to help researchers, help authors describe their studies. So at the one end where we're developing all these models, or validating them, we have the TRIPOD+AI or the claim if you're doing imaging type studies. We then have the STARD guideline. If you turned your AI tool into some diagnostic tool, then there's STARD-AI, which will come out shortly. Then there's the human factors, safety studies, which is Decide AI, all the way through to CONSORT for trials, and then health economics valuation. There's lots of guidance there for researchers to help report their study, depending on which part of the pipeline you're currently in. So I'll wrap up now. AI, massive driver of innovation. It's been a huge disruptor in the healthcare space in the last few years. But it has the potential to be harmful, create healthcare disparities. Like we have the issue around fairness, or it could widen existing ones that are already there. So we need trustworthy AI. We need frameworks and guidelines like Future AI, Tripod, etc., to improve the quality and the standards of research in this area. And there are plenty of tools to do that. I'll stop there, Karim. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary. It was a great presentation, really inspiring. So there are already some questions on the chat, but I'll give some time to people to write down their questions while I ask my own first. So I really like that you guys included these new elements, in particular on fairness. There is a mention of generalizability. And I was wondering whether you thought of adding other dimensions of trustworthy AI that some people deem quite important. So, for example, explainability.
Yeah, we discussed explainability quite extensively, and at the time we were doing it, there was very little consensus on how to achieve explainability. We have all these SHAP values and line value stuff. Very few really have much credibility of those as methods to achieve explainability. So in the absence of robust methods on how to do that, we kind of left it out. And I think we're in the mindset as if we can do really well done, meaningful validation studies or studies testing models in more diverse data sets, more subgroups, and demonstrating where the model doesn't work, that probably achieves as much as we can get in the explainability thing. And it's a very tricky area, explainability. And yeah, in 5 years' time, if we come and update Tripod and let's say the methodology has evolved, we will probably readdress it. But at the time of deriving Tripod, And still now, I'm not sure we're there yet in knowing what we want in explainability.
No, I think you have, you have a good point there. There are many articles, quite prominent ones, that show that it's still an open question.
Yeah.
There is one paper that, if you guys are interested, it starts, I think the title is "The False Hope of Current Explainable Methods." It's a very nice paper, and indeed, it seems that there is still some work to have methods that we can use reliably.
Yeah. I think in that paper, that's what I think they recommend. That was a paper by Marzia Gassemi.
Yes.
I think that's why they're pushing, more validation studies as a better way into the explainability rather than all these other weird methods to do that. So validation is what I would say at the moment.
That's great. So there's a question on the chat, which is, what is the threshold for dataset quantity and diversity?
Excellent question, and I can't give you an answer. I don't know what the answer is, and that's a really hard question. And how do you drive down or drill down into diversity? Yeah, I can't answer that. That's a very hard question.
On the quantity, there are no methods to calculate sample size, at least for evaluation?
Oh, no, for sample, in terms of developing a model and validating the model in the regression world, there's plenty of guidance. There's PM sample size if you're doing model development, and there's PM val sample size if you're doing model validation. They're all premised on a logistic regression model or a Cox model. If you're doing something more complex, they won't fully answer that, but they may be a baseline. If you can do something more complex, if you can't reach the sample size of a regression model, then you're very unlikely to reach the sample size on something more complex. So there is guidance for sample size, but in terms of diversity, that's a hard one because, yeah, I mean, there's something called the Standing Together initiative, which some of you may know about, that was published in Nature Medicine again, I think it was earlier this year, around data diversity, around data representativeness, and they provide some recommendations on how to achieve some of those things. But how you quantify diversity is non-trivial.
That's great. And in terms of diversity, let me try and answer, and then you'll tell me your opinion, Gary. But more than data diversity, I guess what we need, and the term is in the paper, in your paper, is representativeness. If your data set is representative of the real world, of where the AI tool will be used, then I guess we are fine. Would you agree, Gary?
Absolutely. But that's still not straightforward, because even if you're using, say, electronic health records, can we be really confident that that's representative of the population? Possibly not, because if those groups that are underrepresented, they may not be interacting with the healthcare system because of perceived or actual inequalities. So if they're not interacting with the healthcare system and not giving you data or not giving data, that's tricky. So yeah, representativeness and how you demonstrate whether your cohort is representative of the population in whom you're going to use is again non-trivial. A lot of the time we're using existing data that were collected for a completely different reason, and that may or may not be representative of the population in whom you're interested in, but they're the data sets that often we're left to use. At least as an author, you should try and demonstrate, whether your data is representative or not, or have caveats into if it's not.
Okay, this is a question that was submitted at the registration phase when people registered for the webinar. Are you considering some initiative aimed at incorporating this recommendation into regulatory procedures?
So I would hope indirectly TRIPOD does feed into that, into that process. You want regulation to be based on complete and transparent reporting. So I think indirectly they will be, but I think we need to do much more work to integrate those into the regulatory framework more than we do now.
Sounds good. Another question that we asked previously, in TRIPOD.AI, you include component regarding fairness. So fairness with respect to different subgroups according to sex, socioeconomic, etc. And this is very much related to ethical values, that we want AI tools that benefit everyone. But they were asking whether you've considered something regarding to accessibility, because you can have an AI tool that is fair, say with respect to sex, but still it cannot be used everywhere. It cannot be used in a small clinic where the equipment is not the same, or in low-income countries. What do you think?
I agree. It depends on your aim. So let me say I'm developing a model for the UK. I don't care about it working in Africa. That's just the bottom line. That my research goal is to get it working in the UK. If my research goal is to get a tool that works in a low resource country, then I have to have that in the planning. You know, what kind of predictors are available, what kind of information is available from the healthcare systems in those low resource settings, and that would influence how I would develop my model. But it would depend on the aim of the model.
Sounds good. There was a question on the chat regarding data sharing. So, of course, you believe in open science, you believe in data sharing, I imagine, but there are a lot of ethical limitations. So what's your view on that?
Absolutely. I believe, and I think I said in my talk, not everything can be shared. And that's the just facing reality. Not everybody can share their data because of ethical or legal or contractual reasons. That's fine. But at least you should tell the reader openly, I can't share my data because of X, Y, and Z. Just don't leave it for the reader to guess. And so that's the same with code. You know, sometimes you can release your code. Most of the time, I think you should be able to release your code. But there may be instances where there's some proprietary information in that code that you can't share. That's fine, but just tell the reader.
Yes. There's a question that says, how would you check for AI disclosure control? I'm not sure I understand it fully. Do you, Gary?
No.
How would you check for AI disclosure control? And perhaps, I don't know if the person meant this, but there was another question during registration, which is related to the fact that perhaps some people cannot disclose everything. So for example, if a company publishes about an AI tool, perhaps they want to keep some information confidential. What's your view on this?
It depends on what information they're trying to keep confidential. I agree that quite often there'll be certain things you can't disclose, but that should be still expressed that you can't disclose it, this kind of information. Just at least tell the reader that you can't disclose it. Just be honest about it.
Okay. Okay, let me get to other questions here. Yeah, so another question here is for this predictive model, sometimes they are authored by clinical researchers, and perhaps they are more thorough, and they're interested to be thorough because they're interested in the whole pipeline and also in the clinical application. But sometimes they are published by ML engineers, and they're only interested about the methodology. So perhaps TRIPOD+AI is too constraining for engineers that just want to focus on an architecture or a new ML method. What's your opinion on
Yeah,
this?
I mean, TRIPOD+AI is primarily focused on. It's not focused on methodology. So it's not focused on your typical Journal of Machine Learning Research article. That's not what TRIPOD is aimed for. TRIPOD is aimed for, I'm developing a model and I want that model to be used on the patient. So I think the audiences are quite different. I wouldn't use TRIPOD+AI in a methodology study.
Okay. Another question, what is your opinion on the role of research funding bodies in improving transparency?
I think research funders could do a lot more, as could journals as well. You know, the journals are essentially the gatekeepers of published research, you know, and they should have some mechanisms to improve what authors, you know, we have these reporting guidelines. You know, somebody needs to do something around, you know, we have peer reviewers, for example, who check the methods. Can't we do something around reporting? Can't we use large language models, for example? This is what large language models will be good at, is to check reporting. And can we embed those in editorial systems? And journals, for example, could also get get researchers at the early stage to think about reporting guidelines at the start of the study. You know, and as a condition for funding is to consider them.
Okay. Another question was, so some recent development use federated learning to train these AI predictive models, where the data sits in the clinical institutions. Do you think such models are less transparent? What's your opinion on such approaches?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know.
No problem. Perhaps something to think about.
Yeah.
Perhaps the last question. More questions are being written, and perhaps we'll put you in an email, at least for you to know that these questions were asked. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But one question that was that I wanted to ask you is, you promote reporting things related to PPI, so patient public involvement, but perhaps we would like to know more in terms of stakeholder engagement. We would like to know whether clinicians were involved, perhaps carers, perhaps data managers, I don't know, nurses or GPs, if the nurses or the GPs will use this. So is this something that's there or something that you could include in the future?
I think it's something we could bring out more than what we do. Because usually, most of the times, at least in the clinical literature, clinicians are involved, nurses less so, carers less so. You know, we did focus on PPI, but I think we could probably bring out more stakeholder involvement when you're developing a model. And yeah, that's something to think about going forward. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's great. Well, Gary, thanks again. This was really a lovely and very interesting session. Thank you for everyone for joining. We were more than 200 today. This is really a great attendance. Thank you for the questions. Some also, in fact, helped answer the questions. I can read them, so this is extremely helpful. And we will put the session on YouTube, and we will organize the next session, which will take place sometimes in April. And we will contact you. Thank you, everybody, again. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Great pleasure, and we keep in touch.
Okay.
Goodbye.